You know, Brian, there was an article that was sent to you and I from Tom Parks, our 401k guru, talking about model portfolios. And I thought that would be a great topic because the article said that so many financial advisors are using model portfolios, and just made me think about what is in there and how long I've seen these model portfolios. I can go back to the early 1990s when really these portfolios started to come about. And really what it is an opportunity to have a good asset allocation, some diversification. But as always, it needs context.
Model portfolios, I think they really started from asset managers, the companies that manage the mutual funds and ETFs, where they're like, hey, here's some ideas about how you can use our strategies for your clients. And now there are also independent agencies, research firms that create them. So it might be what we would call advisor agnostic. So it's not like they're favoring like a BlackRock or a Vanguard or anything like that.
But that is something that we've seen for decades and decades. This is not a new concept, but it is interesting.
Especially since a lot of these companies, they're actually getting a little bit more sophisticated with how they're presented, the commentary around it, and maybe the support that they provide in terms of, trading ideas. But these are, in a way, kind of cookie cutter options sometimes. I always view them as being a good starting point, but not the ending point. And they're not necessarily always appropriate for every client. I think you've seen over the years how clients come in, they might have one portfolio, and then how do you get them to whatever that target is? And number one, should that target be a model that is taken off the shelf? Or should that model be customized? Or should it be bespoke? And then how do you get from point A to point B? Instead of just ripping off the Band-Aid, paying all the taxes on some low-cost basis holding that you might have just to get into this model, that doesn't really seem like that's putting the client first.
And you really think about, someone comes in and they have a bag full of statements that they've accumulated from a broker, from an insurance company, from a bank, and they go, what do we do with all of this stuff? And so really it starts with trying to put everything together and see what the portfolio looks like. But, there are some benefits to these model portfolios, such as simplicity and, having diversification and perhaps being cost effective. One of these things that we consider as a downside, and sometimes it's lack of transparency and lack of control. So the first thing you want to do is when you bring in the portfolio and say you've inherited some shares of a utility from grandma, there is a low-cost basis stock in there, for example. We need to understand it. So there are some pros and some cons, but the first thing that we do is say, what is in your portfolio? And that's the reason why I say it, and why is it there? So if you have an old utility stock or an old telephone stock, for example, that you've had for a long time, what is the cost basis? Why is it there? How much are you paying for it?
Yeah, and that's part of what we sometimes call transition planning, where you look at it, can we put restrictions on it to make sure that we're not necessarily taking that tax hit right away? Or sometimes it does make sense to take that tax hit right away, because if you're in the, if you look at capital gains rates, and are you in the 0% bracket? Are you in the 15%? Are you in the 20%? Are you in the level where you're going to have to pay that interest income tax, the 3.8%, right? There's all these different considerations. Sometimes you do want to pay the taxes sooner rather than later if you can do it at a 0% rate or at a 15% rate. But then you also raise that really great point about, I think, the transparency, right? Can you actually meet with the people and understand the thinking behind how that portfolio is designed, and then what is it likely going to deliver? Is it aligned with your goals, or is it just something that was taken off the shelf and there isn't necessarily kind of a great story or narrative around how it is designed and then how it's managed?
There's some things that you should not ignore, and those are your personal circumstances. Make sure that you're monitoring portfolios and performance and not making an emotional decision. We can help you through this process, folks. We'll have a system to go through to say, this is what you own, line by line. We walk through it and say, this is a hold, this is a sell, this is perhaps a better idea. And we don't make emotional decisions. And then we say, this is what it could look like. And as Brian started the conversation, this is how we transition over. It's thoughtful. We put it on the screen. It is part of our initial conversation. You can get that by contacting us today.